victims' voices are heard in the judicial process. We're so excited that you're here. Thank you so much. We're grateful for the Huntsman Foundation, Family Foundation, for their support of this event. Thank you for being here. We are, it's an interesting time. I mean, Paul has been is connected to this case that we constantly hear about in the news, and also other very important cases he's represented as the victims in, and it's just really quite an honor. As I'm about ready to introduce John up, John I've known for probably 30 years since I moved to Park City, and on 2022, one morning, which I rarely get the hard copy of the Salt Lake Tribune, I opened it up and I read the story of the public apology from the Utah Department of Public Safety to John and his family around the mishandling of the case of his former wife Valerie and the mother of his children. And that case was so compelling to read that. I had known John for all these years. I hadn't known that story. And really exposing what what that generational impact looks like when somebody doesn't receive healing and care and justice. And so for their family to be so vulnerable to share their story, I really appreciate that. It takes a lot of courage, and to follow up after Valerie's passing with trying to pursue justice was just really impacted me. A couple years later, I picked up the book that is available here, Hometown Betrayal, which recounts that story. And it's a very honest account, and that really moved me. Again, I reached out to John, and then last summer he reached out to me and said, you need to hear the work of Dr. Nadine Harris. We've started this nonprofit, GenerationAll. This is our direction, and we are trying to disrupt that trauma, catch it early. And this Dr. Nadine Harris has been doing it in California. They are really modeling what they're trying to do here in Utah around her work. And it's, I don't know if you've heard of ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experience, like doing a screening early on in pediatric appointments to identify it, to provide wraparound care, support, healing for victims of trauma, and specifically sexual assault. That helps break that cycle of generational trauma. So when I heard that, I had actually a visceral response, and I said, yes, I would love to join your movement. And I'm pleased to invite John up here. I'm so grateful for him and his family, what they've done to move this forward. And it starts with a voice, and the fact that they've shared their voice and are moving forward with change. So thank you, John, and welcome.
Thank you, Karen. I was telling Karen the last time that I was at the Park Meadows golf course was when she whipped me out on the golf course. It was such a brutal beating, I never came back. But I love the Marriotts, I love your family, and your dad's been a real close friend of mine for so many years. So it's a real privilege to be here today, and to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. And we're grateful for so many of you that have contributed and helped make the organization, and Karen for joining our board. She's pretty organized, as you all know. If you know Karen, she's whipping us into shape in case anybody has any doubt. Isn't that right, Sage? But thank you and the Marriott Daughters Foundation for all the good work that you do and sponsoring this event and being a member of the board. It's really, we're so grateful for that. And thanks again, as Karen mentioned, to the Huntsman Mental Health Foundation for being our sponsor, our title sponsor today. These two families do such wonderful work around the state and helping to address the mental health issues that many of us face and the root causes. And we're honored to have them as partners. I'd like to also welcome and introduce my family that's here today. My wife, Natalia, who's smiling at me right here and now. That's good. And raise your hands so everybody knows you. And then I've got Jacobs, Brooke, and Thad. and our granddaughter Aiden, and is Leah here yet? Leah, I can't see Leah. Oh, there's Leah back there. And Kate, I want to say Hammond, but yeah, Kate Hammond is sitting, I think I got something else, but Kate's sitting there, and Leah's over here. And so thank you for coming up and sharing this experience with us today. And also, Karen mentioned Sage Hancock, who's the director of GenerationAll, and Alyssa, and Arturo, and Claire's back there. Raise your hand. Thank you for all the good work you've done to help Karen get this and make us such a successful gathering. It's really exciting. Wow. So I lived here in Park City for 20 plus years. We raised our family here. I have a lot of roots here and a lot of great friends. And it's good to be back. We do have a home in Promontory, but it doesn't seem like Park City. So anyway, it's good to be back here. And thank you, Karen, for hosting this here today. I'm going to start by sharing a short video that will kind of explain that we produced about GenerationAll. I think it sets the stage for the things that we're going to talk about today. So, you ready?
Some stories don't end with one person. They echo through families. GenerationAll exists to drastically minimize the generational impact of trauma, specifically sexual abuse. Because what happens after trauma doesn't stay contained. It can shape health, relationships, and even your genetics for generations. That's generational trauma. The physical, mental, and emotional impact passed down. Even when the next generation didn't experience the original event. It can show up as anxiety, toxic stress, chronic illness, and patterns of connection that are hard to name, but easy to feel. And it doesn't stop there. Partners, children, and loved ones can carry secondary trauma, often without recognition or support. Childhood sexual abuse and trauma are more common than many people think. And the ripple effects touch entire communities. We exist to bring clarity, language, and support to what families have been carrying, and to prioritize upstream efforts to disrupt the cycle. We do it 3 ways: awareness, healing for survivors and their families, and advocacy. Awareness creates education and safe spaces for honest conversations. Healing supports both survivors and their families, because cycles don't break unless everyone impacted has access to healing. Through tools like the Portal, families can find the right resources at the right time. Advocacy helps communities through policy efforts that prevent harm before it starts, and respond with evidence-based care. Through Healing Generations in Utah, we're reducing the generational impact of trauma, including the effects of adverse childhood experiences. Because when we strengthen families, we strengthen the next generation. We believe real change can happen within one generation, for survivors, for families, and for what comes next. Join us at GenerationAll.org and at Generation.all.
When I first saw this, it was a total surprise. Sage and the team had put this together, and I thought it was so well done explaining what we're trying to do at GenerationAll and the impact it has on families. The genesis of GenerationAll was the investigation and publishing of the book Hometown Betrayal. This is a picture of Valerie that I took as a high schooler. She was, I think, 16 or 17 when I took this picture. And it's the cover of the book, which you'll find here in the back. We've got copies for those who would like to have one. The next slide is a picture of Valerie when she was 15 in 1969. She was beautiful, talented, authentic, athletic, scholarly, and principally centered. In 1985, 17 years and 4 children later, Valerie began to experience severe depression, suicide ideation, deteriorating physical and emotional functionality. It was then we began to realize and understand her decline was rooted in sexual abuse 17 years earlier. It wasn't until 1985 we learned she had been brutally raped and traumatized for 18 to 24 months by a highway patrolman and a relative who both lived in the same community. The first half of the book details her experience, the effect it had on our family, and the criminal cover-up by the Department of Public Safety after we had filed a complaint in 1991. Valerie passed away at age 62 in 2017, but she never strayed from the details of what happened to her. She was very consistent in sharing and being able to recall many of the things that were suppressed for many years, and also willing to help others and share her experiences and working with people who had similar experiences. The second half details the forensic investigation that we initiated in 2020 when my son Ryan proposed we re-look at what happened to his mother. And I must admit that I wasn't very excited about this because it was going to reopen chapters of our life that I really had put away and pushed deep inside. So I was really basically against it, but he was pretty persuasive. And but as we went through this, the children also struggled with the investigation and what surfaced during and what we learned, which was remarkable. Furthermore, I didn't expect to learn anything new because it was so many years later. And I thought basically in 1991 when the case was closed by the Department of Public Safety that that's about all we'd ever had. But the result was a remarkable and yet emotionally painful investigation that uncovered many unknown details of the horrible things that were perpetrated upon her. The culture of silence that enabled her assailants and the criminal cover-up that included not only the highway patrolman, but the Internal Affairs Office and the Department of Public Safety, and the commissioner himself, the chief public safety officer for the state of Utah. Although the story of Valerie's experience doesn't conclude with a happy ending, her experience is not unique. I think we all know this, that countless others have experienced similar pain, including the generational impact that sexual abuse has on families. In the video we just watched, it said that 1 in 8 children experience sexual child abuse. Those are just reported numbers nationwide, and in Utah it's somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 7. And we also know that many cases, and I would say most cases, are never reported. So it's very widespread, and it affects, if I was to ask everybody in the room if they know someone, or if they themselves experience sexual abuse, I would say that 80 to 90% of the hands would go up. We've all been affected by this in one way or another. It's like dropping a pebble in a smooth pool of water. It goes out everywhere and in every direction. And I'm sure that many of you know this. Paul Cassell, who's going to talk to us in a few minutes, was a key member of our legal team when we assembled, which we assembled to pursue a measure of justice for Valerie. Without Paul's influence and legal expertise and respect he had garnered from the state's AG office, and I will say that Spence Austin is here. He at that time was the chief criminal officer of the state of Utah. He's here today with us. He would agree that Paul had great respect within the state and the Attorney General's office. And it was because of that that I believe we were able to settle our claim with the state of Utah. Perhaps Paul will share a little bit later some of his perspective on this particular case, which was eventually settled out of court in 2022. Thank you, Paul, for being here today. And with that, I'm honored to introduce our featured speaker today. Paul Cassell is the Ronald N. Boyce Presidential Professor of Criminal Law and Distinguished University Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. That's a mouthful. He is a leading scholar on crime victims' rights and has taught at the law school at the University of Utah since 1982. Paul Cassell received a BA from Stanford University in 1981. He then graduated Order of the Coif. Does anybody know what that means? I had to look it up. But basically it means the very top 10% of the class at Stanford Law School. Serving as president of the Stanford Law Review. In 84 and 85, he clerked for then Judge Antonin Scalia, when Scalia was on the U.S. Court of Appeals to the U.S. D.C. Circuit. In the following year, he served as a clerk for Chief Justice Warren E. Burger of the Supreme Court. In 1992, Paul began teaching at the S.J. Quinney College of Law and published Wild, a leading academic journals on crime victims' rights and other criminal justice issues. He has filed briefs and orally argued on behalf of crime victims and allied organizations in the United States Supreme Court and other federal and state courts around the country. Isn't it amazing that we have a person like Paul in our midst and we don't even really, many of us know about this terrific individual? And so in 2002, Paul was confirmed by the U.S. Senate to serve as a U.S. District Court Judge for the District of Utah. While on the District Court, Professor Cassell wrote many opinions and attracted similar attention, including several crime victims' rights issues. He resigned his position in 2007 to continue teaching law at the University of Utah. So Paul currently teaches crime victims' rights and other courses at the law school. He co-authored Victims in Criminal Procedure, the only law school case book on victims' rights. I heard him say he's also writing another book that's soon to be published on victims' rights. He's written a number of substantial law review articles on related issues and the importance of victims' impact statements and victims' rights to attend a trial. For 12 years, as I think Karen mentioned, he represented the victims of the Jeffrey Epstein sex trafficking organization in an effort to set aside Florida's non-prosecution agreement with those that were immunized, were treated with immunity on the Epstein co-conspirators. So it's my honor to have Paul here today, and let's give him a welcome hand, and we'll have him come forward and speak.
Better make sure I speak into the microphone. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, John, for that introduction. When they asked me to speak, I said, look, there'll be two conditions. One is, I teach law school classes, and I can't function at all unless I have a PowerPoint, even though that's against every single instruction for how to be an effective public speaker. And you can, I'm sure in the back row, you can read the fine print there. Now, I'll tell you what you need to know. The second condition was that I said, look, like a law school class, like, paper chase, Professor Kingsfield and all, if somebody hasn't done the reading in the crowd, have you all done the reading? I get to call on them and cold call on them, but no, I'll try to give you all the information you need to know. I'll be talking about the crime victims' rights movement because I think it's interesting. John is talking about what GenerationAll has done in an area of providing social support for sexual abuse survivors. Also, there is a legal side, and I'm a lawyer, so I'll be talking about the legal side, which I think helps to set the stage then for some of the other efforts that are being done by good organizations like GenerationAll. The crime victims' rights movement has been described, I think, quite accurately as one of the most successful civil rights movements, which is the way I look at it over the last, almost 50 years now. And so I want to talk about basically the past, present, and future of crime victims' rights in our nation's criminal justice system, because I think it's a really interesting trajectory that's still continuing. John mentioned, for example, our work in the Valerie Miller case, where we were trying to push the boundaries of some things that crime victims could do in the system. So let's go back now. I'm going to cover, let's see, how many, my math's correct here, I think I'm going to do about 190 years of history in 1 minute and 38 seconds. So bear with me here. But basically, it's very interesting when you look at the history. If you go back to 1789 with the birth of our nation, what did America's criminal justice system look like back in 1789? And it's quite a bit different than the system that we all see and know it functions here in Summit County and other places in Utah and elsewhere. Back then, if somebody stole your cattle or whatever, it would be up to you as the victim of the crime to prosecute that case, a system of private prosecution. So maybe you'd have some help from the constable to round up the bad guy, but at that point it would be up to you to initiate the criminal charge, to pursue that through court. And then ultimately, back then, many of the criminal penalties were associated with restitution, getting maybe payment back for your lost cattle or something like that, as opposed to our more modern system of criminal penalties like prison terms and things like that. And so that's the way the system operated back in 1789. And over time, we've moved to a system of public prosecution. You get to vote for your county attorney here in Summit County or a DA down in Salt Lake County. And it's that way all across America, where we have a system of public prosecution with public prosecutors essentially operating a monopoly over our criminal justice system, making the final decision whether to file charges or not to file charges. And so here, shout out to our local Summit County Attorney's Office. I'm not unbiased on this topic because my wife was the chief prosecutor here in Summit County for a number of years, working for her boss, Margaret Olson, who I think runs I'm going to date myself here. I think Margaret Olson is a crackerjack county attorney. Is that still a term? I don't know. My students look at me like, what? I don't know. But you saw that office in action, many of you, with the recent Richens case, where really one of the finest prosecution efforts I've seen. My wife had retired at that point, but just a tremendous job. And the jury, randomly selected individuals in Summit County, deliberated for 3 hours after a three weeks of very complicated evidence. So that's the system we have today of public prosecutors like County Attorney Olson and others making the decisions. But do we want to have the system operate in a way where there's a complete monopoly over the decisions that are made without any involvement whatsoever of crime victims who are affected? And yes, I'm going to be using the term victim rather than a term survivor that's often used in the discussions of this type, because I'm a lawyer, and victim is a defined term of art. It has legal meaning. It means the person who was harmed by the crime that is alleged or charged in a particular case. And over time, what we've seen is a transition from, let's say, 1976, the bicentennial of our Declaration of Independence, and in 1976, at that time, if you looked at America's criminal justice system, you would see a system that essentially ignored victims. Victims had no real rights, no real place in the criminal justice process. Sure, they might show up to be a witness at some point in a criminal prosecution, but other than that, they were essentially ignored. And so that fact that victims were ignored in the process, left in the cold, I think has spawned a movement now over the last roughly 50 years. And it's interesting, I just have written a recent article trying to figure out where did that movement come from. And there are a number of different strands that I think you can identify as weaving together to produce this crime victims' rights movement. Academics began to look at a field called victimology. John kind of touched on some of the things that maybe now we're starting to learn about the victims movement. I think I just pushed the wrong button there. So, also, we have, for example, the introduction of victim compensation programs that include ways for victims to be compensated for damages that were caused by criminal justice harms. Also, the rise of the women's movement. The women's movement recognized that, for example, for cases of sexual assault, which disproportionately involve women as victims, oftentimes women would be attacked in the criminal justice system. What was she doing out late at night, and why was she wearing that outfit? Those sorts of antiquated notions that were subject to great criticism and indeed reform with things like rape shield rules and other changes. Also in the 1960s, many of you are aware that crime rates increased significantly. Academics are still debating why there was an increase in crime, but that produced dissatisfaction with a system that seemed to ignore the interests of victims. And then also there was a growth of victim advocacy from organizations like, for example, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which focused on problems of drunken driving and the criminal justice lack of response. It's interesting, if you go back 40 or 50 years ago, drunk driving wasn't even a crime. It was boys will be boys kind of a thing, perhaps, that the system essentially swept under the rug, which of course Mothers Against Drunk Driving has succeeded in changing. And so we have these confluence of different factors. One of the very significant factors occurred in 1982 when President Reagan appointed a task force on victims of crime, diverse representation from public and private sector, people all over the country. They held hearings and ultimately produced a final report in 1982 that listed, I think, about 100 different recommendations for incorporating crime victims into our criminal justice system, giving them rights, for example, the right to give a victim impact statement at sentencing, and just a variety of things that really set the stage for the movement then to begin taking concrete steps to pass legislative and other reforms in the criminal justice system. The report concluded that innocent victims of crime have been overlooked, their pleas for justice have gone unheeded, and their wounds, personal, emotional, and financial, have gone unattended. And so that report was released in 1982, and if you look at the 1980s, there was just a tremendous growth in the years that followed in crime victims' rights. And so nowadays, I've got a chart here of the United States. The states that are in green are states that have passed a state constitutional amendment giving victims of crimes rights. And the state constitution is our fundamental charter. For example, here in Utah, it's how our state is organized and sets the basic foundational law for our state. So we're in green because in 1994, we passed, those of you who were voters in the state might recall in the election in 1994, we passed the Utah Victims' Rights Amendment. I was pleased to be part of the victims' effort that was presenting that amendment. Received a substantial support of, I think, 70% of the voters throughout the state. And it gave basic rights in the process to crime victims, such as the right to be notified about events in the criminal justice process, and the right to be heard at pivotal points in the process. For example, the bail hearing, if the defendant is going to be released, should there be maybe a protective order or other conditions on that release? If there's going to be a plea bargain, shouldn't the victim have an opportunity to express her views on what that outcome might mean? To have a voice in the process, not a veto, because the judge will end up making the final decision, but at least an opportunity to express the victim's point of view to the judge. Or at sentencing, shouldn't the victim be able to be heard to talk about losses that came from the crime that might be compensated through a restitution order, or to provide the victim's point of view on the appropriate sentence? And that's what Utah did, just as 35 other states have done over the years, And even in the remaining 14 states, many of them have passed statutes providing for the protection of crime victims' rights of the type that you see here listed in Utah. One of the things that I think is interesting now to see what happened as a result of that victims' rights movement. In all 50 states today in America, victims are given the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement at sentencing. And so a prominent illustration of that is the Larry Nassar case a couple of years ago. Some of you might recall that those proceedings were televised, and that 150 victims of the defendant in that case came forward to tell their stories about how they had been sexually abused and the effect that that continued to have on themselves and their families and others as a result of that crime. And that was, I think, a sort of cultural moment because so many people were exposed to victim impact statements. The events were televised, they were national news, and I'm sure many of you recall that. And so I highlight that case just as an example where I think if we'd gone back to 1976 or earlier, victims wouldn't have been giving a victim impact statement. But over the last 10 years, currently today, victims are expected to give a victim impact statement, and the Nassar case is a good illustration of that. Now another, I've talked so far about the states, but I think it's also important, as John mentioned, I was in the federal criminal justice system for a while, and I worked as a federal district court judge here in Utah. And during my time on the bench, the Federal Crime Victims' Rights Act was enacted, a Bill of Rights for crime victims. The precise details here aren't important, but you can see a long listing of 10 different rights for victims throughout the federal criminal justice process, affecting dramatic change in the way that federal cases are resolved. These rights are, for example, the right to confer with prosecutors about how a case is going to be resolved, and to provide information at the bail hearing or the plea bargain or the sentencing hearing, a right to restitution for the losses that the criminal has caused as part of the crime. And so this set up a architecture for victims' rights in our nation's federal criminal justice system. To be sure, most cases in the United States, criminal cases, are prosecuted at the state level, but some very significant cases go through the federal system, and so this provided an opportunity for victims to be heard. And so one of the things that's interesting to think about with the victims' rights movement is I like this slide when I teach my crime victims' rights class. You'll notice that we have a courtroom here with the bench for the judge at the head of the courtroom, but then we have 3 tables rather than the conventional 2 tables of plaintiff versus defendant, because I think that is sort of metaphorically what the victims' rights movement is trying to do. Of course, defendants should have the right to effective assistance of counsel to present their interests. Prosecutors, of course, should be presenting the interests of the public, but victims also have interests that ought to be presented to the court and an opportunity to be heard about those interests. And so the quote here is kind of interesting. This is from a Ninth Circuit decision out in California in 2006. It says, "The criminal justice system has long functioned on the assumption that crime victims should behave like good Victorian children, seen but not heard." That was the traditional view of victims, which changed in the federal system in 2004 with the Crime Victims' Rights Act. And so an example of how that changed the landscape, this is a sketch of me in 2014, arguing for a victim of child sexual abuse materials who had been harmed by a crime, and the defendant, Mr. Paroline, was then being asked to pay significant restitution to my client, who I'll refer to as Amy. Amy was seeking restitution for that crime, and the issue of what size of restitution award that she should receive was argued in the U.S. Supreme Court, and I was honored to be able to represent Amy. And this is an example of the 3 tables that I mentioned. Typically, the U.S. Supreme Court has 1 hour for oral argument, and so this case was set for 1 hour, but it was divided up into 3 parts. Mr. Paroline, the defendant, got 20 minutes. The Justice Department for the government got 20 minutes, and I got 20 minutes to present Amy's claim. Sadly, the U.S. Supreme Court did not accept my position. but they also call on Congress to fix the issue. And so with the support of our home state senators, Senator Orrin Hatch, and a New York senator, Senator Chuck Schumer, coming together on a bipartisan basis, we passed the Amy, Vicky, and Andy Act to change restitution for these cases to provide effective compensation. Another illustration of the kinds of cases that are now possible under the Crime Victims' Rights Act is a case that I worked on for 11 years. Back in 2008, my friend Brad Edwards, an attorney down in the Southern District of Florida, he and I got together to represent victims of the Epstein sex trafficking organization. There was a sweetheart plea deal that was done secretly by the federal prosecutors that essentially swept the case largely under the rug and immunized most of the participants in that criminal conspiracy. But that was done, you remember the slide a couple of moments ago about the Crime Victims' Rights Act, which says that victims of crime have an opportunity to confer with prosecutors, an opportunity that was denied to the victims in that case, I think by design, because if there had been public conferral about what the proper outcome was in that case, there would have been outrage over that deal. And so for 11 years, Brad and I fought for the victims of the Epstein sex trafficking organization in Florida, trying to get that plea deal set aside. Well, unfortunately, the judge ruled in 2018 that we had proven the victims' rights were violated, but then at that point some other events intervened in New York. I think it's fair to say that we made such a fuss down in Florida that the federal government was embarrassed by what happened, and the prosecutor's office in the Southern District of New York filed charges arresting Epstein, and then ultimately Epstein committed suicide, so the case could not be pursued to a conclusion against him. But it was pursued to a conclusion against Ghislaine Maxwell. And even when Epstein committed suicide, this slide here shows the women who were victimized by Epstein in the courtroom in the Southern District of New York, who were able to give a victim impact statement about what Epstein had done to them, and had some small measure of justice from at least being able to speak. One more, let's see. So where does that leave us then for the future? I think where that, let's see. Future is blurry, I guess. Here we go. Here's an agenda for the legal side of the victims' rights movement, things that I think we should be thinking about. One of the issues, I think perhaps the biggest issue that the legal crime victims' rights movement faces is access to counsel. I'm a pro bono attorney. I'm proud that the University of Utah gives me the opportunity to work on these cases and then write articles about them. Many of my students are involved learning about actual legal cases from participating in my classes where we, under appropriate confidentiality agreements, discuss what the best strategies might be for presenting an argument one way or the other. I think a few of my students are even here today, so hopefully they can attest to the fact that that gives them a good opportunity to learn how to be attorneys on these kinds of challenging cases. But the larger issue is, how do we create effective legal representation for crime victims? Many of the issues that I've skimmed over today involve highly technical questions of how to assert rights, and how to provide legal representation, I think, is a challenge. I think we need to think about enforcing victims' rights more effectively. You remember that, for example, the Utah Victims' Rights Amendment says that victims should be treated with fairness, dignity, and respect, but exactly what that looks like, I think, is yet to be determined by courts. It's been hard to figure out how to enforce those general open-ended rights and to give them some concrete content. I think we need to address the fact that there are many criminal cases that are not cleared or solved in America. Some of the latest statistics are that about 20% of serious crimes are cleared, which means about 80% of crimes are not cleared. We need to think about providing victim justice by providing effective law enforcement that can reach a conclusion by identifying those who are involved. We might also think about how to expand victim involvement in situations where there's a lack of charge. The Valerie Miller case that John talked about, that was a case where no charges, criminal charges, were ever filed in a timely manner. Should victims be able to challenge a decision not to have charges filed? Fortunately, here in Utah, our legislature, I think, has been very effective in taking a look at some of those issues. And a few years ago, we passed a law that allows our Utah Attorney General's office to take a second look at cases where no charges have been filed, just to make sure that there was not something that was overlooked in those cases. And there are, I think we also need to think about expanding victims' rights around the nation, including maybe even passing a federal constitutional amendment. We have a list of rights for criminal defendants in our Constitution, which is quite appropriate, but I think it would similarly be appropriate to list in our federal Constitution a list of rights for crime victims. And so those are some of the agendas on the crime victims' rights legal agenda. But let me kind of finish with this slide here. I'm a lawyer, so you would give me a social problem, I'll give you a legal answer. But of course, the problems that America faces and problems that, for example, sexual assault survivors face are multifaceted. I do think it's important to have the kinds of legal rights that I've described in place in our legal system, but it's also important that we provide responses like what GenerationAll is doing to deal with the intergenerational trauma. And of course, there are many other social organizations that are doing that as well. But I think what GenerationAll has identified is a gap in some of our existing coverage with existing support organizations, and is trying to fill that gap here in Utah and elsewhere. So I think I'll stop there. I didn't have a chance to call on any of you to make sure that you've done the reading, but hopefully that gives you some background about the crime victims' rights movement and how that sets, I think, the legal architecture for some of the other issues that we're talking about.
We actually are not done with Paul yet, which is good. We're going to ask him some questions. Okay, can we have just another round of applause for Paul? Thank you. I just needed a second to prepare myself to question a lawyer. That felt a little intimidating, but I just wanted you guys to be able to maybe know non-PowerPoint Paul as well, and let him speak off the cuff and maybe try and, get him a little flustered. Just kidding, but I feel like it was incredibly helpful to hear, several hundred years of history, and now being able to talk about some of these cases that you've worked on, that you feel passionate about, and the advancement that it's had towards victims' rights. One of them that you mentioned specifically was the Jeffrey Epstein case. This is one that a lot of you guys have followed closely. It's kind of hard to maybe not follow it closely if you are any fan of news anywhere. But you personally represented some of those victims. From a victim's rights perspective, what do you feel like went wrong in that case, and where did the system fail those survivors?
Yeah, so when you look at the Epstein case, I mean, I'm going to sound like a tort lawyer or something here, but it's an example of how power and influence, unfortunately, affects our criminal justice system, because Jeffrey Epstein was able, by using his connections, his high-powered legal team and others, to get I think it's fair to say, pretty well demonstrated now, sweetheart plea deal that was done secretly, that essentially meant that he did actually serve some time. Let's see, what was it? He got 12 months of work release. So what that involved was he would go home at night, for 8 hours and sleep in the state facility, and then he would spend 16 hours a day shuffling papers at his office, and that was the plea deal for trafficking, sexually trafficking dozens and dozens, by many accounts, several hundreds of underage women and girls. So that was a case, a deal that would never have been reached if the process had been properly followed, where the prosecutors had conferred with the victims' families, conferred with the victims to determine what would be the right outcome. Because the right outcome for an international sex trafficking organization involving dozens and dozens of victims is certainly not the kind of plea deal that was arranged in that particular case. And so one of the things that I think came out of my work and my friend Brad Edwards' work when we were representing the victims in that case is that hopefully the Justice Department will think twice before reaching a secret deal now. And to the Justice Department's credit, they have put in place some additional changes to their regulations for interacting with victims, so that we hope that if the future Epstein case comes through the system, the victims will be conferred with. The outcome will then be, again, the victims' rights movement is not about dictating the outcome, but it's about giving victims a voice in the process, which then allows prosecutors and judges and others to reach an appropriate determination as to what justice demands.
If you guys have read one of the books, Nobody's Girl, that's actually one of the Epstein victims, she actually mentions Paul by name and the work that they did on that case. But that goes to say, like, some people, they wrote books about these things, but they never had the opportunity to be heard. One last question on this one: did the survivors of Epstein ever really get the opportunity to be heard in the way the law intends? And then you mentioned one thing of hopefully if more come out. What does that mean for future victims?
Yeah, so it was interesting. Of course, as we worked our way through the Florida criminal justice system on the Epstein case, we were trying to get a right to confer with the prosecutors. And to make that right to confer a meaningful right, we were asking the federal district court judge there in the Southern District of Florida to set aside the Epstein plea deal, to void it as violating the crime victims' rights. And I remember my job the summer of 2018 was writing the motion to the judge for having the judge determine that the victims' rights were violated. And my friend Brad assembled, I think it was 5 banker boxes of documents. We got a lot of the emails regarding the negotiation of the plea deal, and we were able to show that there was, I think it's fair to say, a deliberate decision to conceal from the victims of Epstein what was going on, because there would have been such an outcry. So we got the judge to declare that the plea deal was done illegally, but then when we were getting to the point of what the remedy was, whether there would be a right to confer in Florida or some kind of different outcome, that's when the New York charges were filed. That's when Epstein was arrested, and then ultimately Epstein committed suicide. So one of the very interesting things that came out of that was, as I briefly mentioned and had the sketch up here, the district court judge, Judge Berman, in the Southern District of New York, held a hearing, and I went to that hearing, and I think there were 24 of the victims that were able to come to that hearing, where they gave a victim impact statement, even though Epstein had committed suicide and was dead, because at that point the judge was going to have to enter a dismissal of the criminal charges. And so that provided a court hearing and an opportunity for the victims to speak. And of course now we're seeing, continual interest in the Epstein files and so forth. I guess I don't want to sound too bitter here, but I sort of wonder, there seems to be a lot of interest here in 2026 in this, but when we were fighting beginning back in 2008, where there was an opportunity to hold a lot of the wrongdoers accountable, there wasn't a lot of interest. So that's my one regret about the case. I worked on the case for 11 years, but I certainly wish there had been more interest. I'll mention just one little side note. Brad and I, there was the Epstein sex trafficking organization reached into New Mexico, the Zorro Ranch down there, for example, where girls and women were trafficked. So we were having trouble, as you could tell, in the federal system getting the victims' rights enforced. So we went to the the authorities in New Mexico to say, look, there is jurisdiction here, there was trafficking here, but they weren't interested. So 3 weeks ago, I walked into my office at the U and I got an email from the New Mexico authorities, I won't identify which one, saying, we've decided to open an investigation into the Jeffrey Epstein case and we would like your assistance. And so, I don't know, better late than never. Well, I'm not actually sure if that's true here, but I wish the authorities there and elsewhere had been more on the ball in a timely manner.
Thanks, Paul. You mentioned 2008, the summer of 2018. I was thinking about what I was doing that time, and it was a lot less significant. And so I just feel grateful that you're here and doing the good work. So I wanted to, I think the Epstein case didn't end happily for a lot of victims who didn't get that chance. Whereas you spoke about the Larry Nassar case, where, over 150 victims were able to speak out. I'm gonna ask you several questions in a row, and you have to answer all of them. Just kidding. So from your perspective, what made that moment so significant, not just legally, but for victims themselves? And what changed for those survivors, or even the broader system, because they were allowed to speak? Do you think it changed the narrative to how people saw survivors of sexual abuse?
Yeah, and so here, as any good law professor will do, I'm going to cite my own research. So if you're interested in the Larry Nassar case, the 2024 issue of the Marquette Law Review has an interesting article on this topic. So if you Google Paul Cassell Nassar case, the paper will pop right up. But what the paper that I put together talks about is that case. You'll recall Nassar had abused more than 100 women and girls over the course of I think decades. So after he pled guilty, the judge in that case, Judge Aquilina, agreed to hold an extensive hearing. And in fact, I think it went on for a total of 7 days. About 150 women came to testify about the effects of Nassar's abuse. And so what I did in the paper was to take those 150 victim impact statements and then analyze them to try to look for commonalities and differences. It's kind of I guess the statisticians would say this is kind of a natural experience. Do 150 women who have been subjected to, very, very roughly speaking, the same crime, do they all respond in the same way or in different ways? And I think you can imagine what the answer to that is. They all respond in different ways. So it was interesting to see what was the content of those victim impact statements and what were they doing. And so one of the things that they were doing, I don't want to use the term closure because victims never really closed the chapter on sexual abuse or other things like that. But there was an opportunity for at least some healing to develop, for them to be recognized, for their credibility to be established, for the judge to recognize them as having been abused. Some of you will recall that Judge Aquilina reinforced the feelings that the victims were having about how they were being believed. But there were a few other interesting things too that came out of our research. Edna Ayres at the University of Illinois was my co-author on this paper. One of the things we noticed that about 1/3 of the women directly, pointed at the defendant and made comments to the defendant as part of the process. And so that, I think, potentially was useful for them. And also, this is a point that I think is sometimes overlooked. I don't know what the right way to put this is, but would that have been useful to Nassar? I mean, we hope that the criminal justice system is an opportunity for somebody to start moving on a different path in life, and perhaps hearing directly from the victims might have made a difference there. One last point, too, is that the Nassar case, like many sexual assault cases, illustrates not just wrongdoing by one individual, but a pattern of enablers, a broader set of institutions that help the abuse to continue over many years. And so the victims were able to speak to organizations such as Michigan State University and the U.S. Gymnastics Association, which I think it's been established certainly didn't respond as effectively to the sexual abuse as would have been appropriate. And so by calling out those other organizations, that did indeed later lead to change in the way that abuse is handled now by our U.S. Athletics programs. Also, Michigan State University made reforms. So I think you see these victim impact statements are not sort of useful just on the one-to-one situation of the individual victim or the individual defendant can have these broader consequences, which are helpful as well.
Keep thinking, wow, Paul does a really good job segueing into my next question, but he did know the question, so he's doing this very well. So we've talked about two kind of big headline cases in federal news, and something that John and Karen so delicately and openly brought up is the Valerie Clark Miller case. That was another case that you were involved in that's local. I'd love to hear kind of your perspective on, one, how is Miller's case unique in Utah, and two, where do you feel like Utah's progress is compared to federally?
Yeah, so that case was quite amazing. John contacted me, 4 or 5 years ago, I guess, and he told me the story. You know, it was one of those like, is this really what's happening? But John then provided, working with his family, had hired some very capable investigators that had kind of pieced together this crime that was decades old. And then the facts were pretty well pieced together by the investigative team. But then for the legal team that we were assembling, the tricky question is, well, what can you do about that? Can you sue the state of Utah? Could you criminally prosecute the individuals? How is this going to work out? And as we started to address the sort of legal side of this, it was the statute of limitations for a direct criminal prosecution was not in the cards. But there seemed to be the possibility of maybe pursuing some kind of civil justice. So civil justice is interesting. You know, a lot of times civil lawyers will say, let's hit the institution for a big damage award or something like that. But that really wasn't the focus. You know, money wasn't the interest here. The interest was justice. And so we went to our Utah Attorney General's office and said, here's the facts that we've pulled together. We think that the right thing to do is for the state of Utah to apologize in a public way that would produce media coverage and would send a message maybe to other victims of sexual assault that they would be believed potentially if they came forward. Also, there was a concern about making changes in the Department of Public Safety to make sure that if there were future claims of abuse by someone employed in the state of Utah, that those claims would be reviewed appropriately and independently without influence from higher ups in the government organization. So those were our objectives, and I know a lot of you probably say, well, those seem like realistic objectives. That seems reasonable, but in so many places around the country, if you go to your state government, you're going to get the door slammed in your face. But fortunately here, our Utah Attorney General's office opened the door to hear us out. Spence Austin, who was here, is I think one of the key players on that, and tried to figure out what is realistic, what is appropriate. And so we were able to reach a settlement where the state of Utah agreed to apologize for what happened, also agreed to make some prospective changes in the way that conflict of interest situations are handled when a government employee is accused of wrongdoing. So part of that was changing the process. Part of that is I do think we were fortunate to have very good people in the Utah Attorney General's office who responded appropriately, Spence Austin being at the top of the list on that.
One last question, and it's the biggest one. If you could design a system that truly supports victims in their healing, what would it look like?
Yeah, of course, that's a very interesting question, because when we talk about supporting victims, we're talking about 51 or 52 different criminal justice systems in America, different states, the federal government, the District of Columbia. How would we set up a system that would truly support victims? And of course, you're asking a lawyer, so my solution is to change the legal system, put that third table into the courtroom so that victims are heard at the appropriate points. I think we also need to change the culture. One of the things that I try to do as a law professor, I'm leaving in a few minutes to go teach criminal law, but I try to teach my students that we need to protect not only the rights of defendants, the rights of the public, but we need to consider the victim's interests in the way that we structure our America's criminal justice system. And so that would, I think, be the system that I would design legally. But then there's also a whole host of other things that need to be done to support victims, because giving someone a legal right to be heard really doesn't do much in situations where the long-term effects of, for example, sexual abuse are continuing among not just the victim herself, but other individuals. And so that's where we need to set up a full panoply of support organizations that can address those needs for victims as well.
Thank you. If you want to give another round of applause for Paul. My favorite thing ever, a picture of me on the screen behind me. I'm gonna go next. Everyone, I just wanted to say I'm so grateful for Paul and his just ability to be open and talk through some of the things that he's literally spent his entire life focusing on doing and literally living. He's in the middle of open cases right now, teaching, and still making time to come and talk to you and teach us some really valuable things that will be helpful in dinner tables later to prove that we're right over other people. And so thanks for being here, thanks for your time, and yeah, thank you for helping us. I just wanted to end by talking a little bit on GenerationAll and what we're doing and how that correlates with why did we bring Paul here? Why is this our mission? Why this event? And something that kept kind of registering and coming back in my mind is this continuum of preventing child sexual abuse. And I made it specific to child sexual abuse because even though we spoke about trafficking victims, even though sexual violence addresses a lot of other types of abuse and assault, the majority of victims, and actually some stats say around trafficking, upwards of 90% of trafficking victims were often first sexually abused as children. So it's this generational pattern that keeps being set. And so that's why I wanted to start with this, and I wanted to talk a little bit on how child sexual abuse, when you look at preventing it, it's seen as this continuum. People talk about primary prevention, educating kids on what it is, secondary prevention, even tertiary prevention, which is healing. And I don't know how many of you guys have really good eyes, but in this tertiary restorative justice section, there is a spot that it says opportunities for healing through restorative justice. That's exactly what Paul does. Being able to be heard, being able to share the impact that your perpetrator and your abuse had on you is incredibly important for healing. And if you guys notice this little arrow on the bottom, we don't see it as a continuum. We don't see prevention as linear. We see it as a circle. When you provide proper healing, you're preventing it for the next generation. So that's something that is really important to us at GenerationAll. Something else that I wanted to talk about with GenerationAll is healing and prevention is often seen in kind of two primary camps. You look at either trying to prevent sexual abuse through addressing victimization, so teaching things like self-defense, teaching things like how can we educate kids on what sexual abuse is and be able to empower them to say no if somebody asks them to do something uncomfortable. There's also the side of perpetration. How can we prevent people to not sexually abuse, not rape, not sexually assault? And there's these two kind of camps that we focus a lot of prevention on. And sorry, I keep standing in front of this, but it's just two words. I apologize. But something that we wanted to do with GenerationAll is we wanted to go further upstream. How can we impact both of these? And that's where, and Karen spoke a little bit about this, that's where we saw this common root cause of childhood trauma, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Fun fact, that's why you guys all have like a deck of playing cards as a thank you, is because we're talking about ACEs today, which are adverse childhood experiences. And this is something that's considered a root cause of not only perpetrating later, somewhere between 9 and 11 times higher likelihood of perpetrating a sexually violent crime if you've experienced childhood trauma, Additionally, victimization. You have a significantly higher likelihood of being abused, being in an intimate partner relationship that's violent, but you also have a whole other slew of things: mental health, earlier life expectancy, lower life expectancy, as well as like chronic illness, things like that. That's why it's so important that we have groups like Marriott Daughters Foundation and Huntsman Mental Health Foundation as part of what we do. And so our mission is to drastically minimize the generational impact of trauma, specifically sexual violence. And if you've noticed, we have that trauma part really highlighted in there, because we know that in order to actually make a difference with sexual violence and to quantitatively reduce victimization and perpetration of sexual violence, we have to address trauma first. That's what will help us be able to reduce it. So we do that in 3 ways. We do awareness, being able to talk about it, talk about generational trauma, talk about secondary trauma, talk about the impact that it has on us physically and mentally. We also look at healing for survivors and their families together. A lot of systems, nonprofits and organizations that do really incredible work, we focus first on the survivor. We want to try and help fill the gap for them in the work that they do by also addressing the family system and ensuring that they all get healing together. And then last is policy. I'm the least qualified person speaking today to talk about policy, but it's something that we've really prioritized. And one of our big focuses this year, you guys can see this in the handout that we gave you, was a policy change and a request for appropriations that we wanted to address adverse childhood experiences across the state specifically. And so about a year ago, we started working with groups like Intermountain, who's here today, University of Utah, looking at, hey, what does healthcare look like in regards to addressing trauma, detecting it early and intervening early, and allowing especially young kids access to wraparound services like mental health based on risk of experiencing something in the future rather than an official mental health diagnosis. So we were able to get the Department of Health and Human Services on board, and we were able to fortunately pass a funding request in this last legislative session that will guide trauma screenings across the state for children. So we're really excited about that and what it's going to look like over the next few years. But that's just one of the policies that we're working on, and we're really trying to be very impactful with it. I just want to end on a positive quote, because I know talking about sexual violence can feel a little bit heavy. Hopefully you guys are like a mimosa or 2 deep, maybe. But this is one of my favorite quotes that I think about often. Remember that although trauma can be passed down through generations, so can healing. This is something that we believe in. We believe that we can make a meaningful impact within one generation, and we're grateful that you guys are here. We're grateful that you're joining us. And one thing really quick is, if we want to thank Karen and her foundation, Marriott Daughters Foundation, she's actually matching $20,000 of donations today for either any like kind of just donation, or if you want to do something like sign up for our golf tournament, she'll match that as well. Hoping this inspires you guys to want to maybe golf. But anyways, we are so grateful for her and for her being involved in seeing our vision and inviting you guys to all learn a little bit about it. So thank you.
Again, I want to thank Sage and the team putting the event together today, and particularly Karen for your good hard work. I also noticed that although he came a little bit late, is our Senate President, Stuart Adams. Stuart met with us months and months ago on the ACE awareness program. And had it not been for the leadership of the legislature, we could not have got the funding to move forward to start treating and screening for children. So Stuart, we want to particularly thank you for your good work, and thank you for supporting this. He's been a great supporter of this effort, and we appreciate you very much. So Karen, would you like to add anything?
Please enjoy more food. And I want to say a special thanks. Please look at your table sponsors. We really appreciate their support, and they're listed at the bottom of the program. But take the materials with you. Grateful for you taking your time to be here today. Have a great rest of your day.
you? Just to be able to be aware of what to look for. Sometimes they just trust what you don't know. Because I don't understand. It's like you don't understand. Until you get out of the house. They're not functioning things. You don't know what to expect. And you're terrified. Yeah. But most people, unfortunately, a lot of people just can't afford it. No, that's what I mean. Like, you don't even know what the therapy person's telling you. Just like going to the dentist. Yeah, yeah. It needs to be just like that. Or going to a doctor. Right. You don't go to a GP behind the home. No. You need a specialist. Yeah, it's very interesting. It was very educational. It was. Nice to meet you, Mickey. Hope to see you on the service day or something. Yeah, okay. Saw your name tag and realized that you're on the Surf Park City board. I helped Karen set up the nonprofit status. I'm Crystal Bowman Carter and I incorporated it. Nice to meet you. Oh, good. Oh, I didn't do the website. I just did the incorporation and got the nonprofit status. I was putting in one of the what our situation was and how we were going to this get a hold of the names. Oh, you mean reserve the name? Yeah, with the Department of Corporation. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Good job. What a great organization. It's using with other ones too. I'm president of the New Notary Club. Oh, yeah, so it's just, it fills a void. Yeah? We can help you. Okay. Can I put my director, volunteer director? We're doing coming up. I'll make sure I know that. The next couple of months, I think I just tripped over that chair and I thought it was me. Yeah, they don't work together. Which I need to be taken in. There's only one shoe, only one problem. Julianne Carone. I will reach out to you. And can I make an email introduction to you? I'll do that. Then you don't have to worry about it. Okay. I'm glad I interrupted your conversation. Yeah, you're welcome. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Vicki.
Oh, I think I'm a great contact. I've done 2 places, a bullying
texted him and it's like, wow, what are you doing in Park City?
They would have had gospel in the bus, and then that makes sense.
I did.
Gracias, Lucas. No, that was for me. That was for me.
So that's one thing that he's doing. I told this story 6, 7 times. But he remembers names, like last time we were talking about different people like the administrators he worked with. It's just talking names. I can't remember what time he's always been a little bit of names. So there's no doubt. And I keep in pretty good touch with us. Like Facebook message all the time. How's like Joe doing?
She's on a very aggressive she's on her second the cancer has gotten worse. They removed most of her lungs on one side, and they're just trying to she's cleansing out her inner body, but it's just not but I can say it because she told me. You have served